sitting down because well, we would prefer to sit up, but because the screen is not there, we won't be able to see. Yeah, but we cannot see the screen, right? So okay, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, if you can, yeah, twist it a little more. Then. Perfect. I'll be.
Okay. Μπορούμε να ξεκινήσουμε. Καλησπέρα. Σκεφτόμουν ως άτυπη εισαγωγή να θυμίσω ότι αύριο δεν εκλέγουμε πρόεδρο Δημοκρατίας. Ενδεχομένως έχουμε το ενδεχόμενο τις εκλογές μπροστά μας. Έχουμε το μνημόνιο κτλ. Τίποτα από αυτά δεν έχει σημασία για μας σήμερα. Η σημασία είναι σε αυτά που θα συζητήσουμε. So, the importance of this session is self-evident, I believe. It is sourced in the subject matter itself, but it also owes a lot to the synthesis of this panel. And of course, I mean our four very distinguished speakers, whom I warmly welcome. Coming to the central theme of the session, we're about to discuss some of the main issues and the causes of the current European predicament. Does it all boil down to European policy failures? Failure to restrict membership of the Eurozone to the structurally convergent and institutionally mature and/or compatible and/or flexible economies. Failure, following that, to stimulate economic and institutional reform within the Eurozone, stimulating instead excessive capital inflows into the periphery. And failure after that to pull the Eurozone out of the Great Recession, instead increasing the risk for deflation and secular stagnation, causing widening economic divergence, exacerbating social imbalances, and fueling right-wing extremism in surplus and deficit, creditor and debtocratic countries alike? Or is it that the European crisis has merely exposed, forcefully though, the dismal dynamics of global capitalism and its morally contestable fundamentals? I mean those regularities or laws which, echoing Thomas Piketty, entail concentration of wealth and increasing economic income inequalities, and which make capitalism prone to crisis, most likely originating in structurally deficient demand and financial folly. And within that dismal context, what will be the political economy of a redistributive social state? Is it likely that democratic capitalism, and for that matter, human capitalism, a European invention, I remind you, is it likely that will come to be considered as a historical peculiarity, as a great illusion indeed, bred in the interwar and especially the post-war era of economic and social reformist expectations, albeit expectations associated with literally exceptional economic and political circumstances? Anyway, being the coordinator of this panel, I have the privilege of raising questions and issues and give no answer to them myself. Others will do the job, I mean our speakers. So I should stop here, and lest I abuse my privileges, which I remind you are only temporary. And let me turn to the specific issues and to the presentations of this session. The first presentation is about the implications of the crisis for the European welfare states. Has the crisis paved the way to a meaningful and long-lasting transformation of the national social contracts, as the crisis as an opportunity optimists would probably reckon? A transformation, I mean, that will allow welfare state to respond effectively to the new economic and social risks, including first and foremost widening economic inequalities. A transformation of the traditional welfare state into a social investment state, as has been named. Or is it that the crisis has caused an acceleration of some longer-term trends, slowly destabilizing the welfare state prior to the crisis, but steadily leading to its dismantling, starting, of course, with the worst-hit countries of the European Union South? Professor David Rueda is going to talk on those issues, discussing in particular whether the crisis has just been another stop on the way to dissolution of the European welfare state. David Rueda is Professor of Comparative Politics at the Department of Politics and International Relations and Professorial Fellow at Nuffield College of Oxford University. He has published in many leading academic journals, and he's the author of Social Democracy Inside Out, which I've enjoyed too much. He has received numerous research awards and has been a fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton University and the Summer Institute at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Professor Webb, you have the floor.
Okay, so I just wanted to start by sort of introducing the general topic of the talk. It is actually quite connected to two of the talks that you saw in the previous session, particularly the ones by Abigail and Dimitri. It is connected to issues about unemployment and inequality, but it also there's some caveats. While in the previous session, people talk about national differences and how these different sort of nations have progressed through the crisis. There's going to be much less about that in my talk. It's really going to be about patterns that are in fact common to most of these OECD countries, these averages that I will show you sort of in a second. It is also much less about measures. I'm just going to sort of play fast and loose with measures, as political scientists often do, and ask you to sort of look at some of the things that I am showing you as sort of descriptive of some of these patterns that we see in the OECD. And also, it's mostly about sort of an argument that is about the state of the welfare state before the crisis. Sort of when we get to the crisis, what is it about the state? What is it, the nature of the welfare state, and how does it affect the ability of governments to sort of mitigate the effects of unemployment on inequality? And it's also sort of the last caveat is that it's not about insiders and outsiders really sort of at all. So let me give you sort of an introduction. Essentially, sort of what I care about is the role of the welfare state in a very particular way. Sort of the welfare state has this traditional role as a buffer between unemployment and inequality. It's what comes traditionally in when bad things happen in the labor market, and it protects people from expanding inequality sort of at some macro level. And this is the sort of Baldwin quote that I have there in one of these classics of the emergence of the welfare state. And the question that I'm trying to explore in this project is this idea of should we assume that the welfare state today remains a powerful buffer between unemployment and inequality? And I'm going to argue that sort of the generosity of the welfare state has been transformed, and that's something to sort of reckon with when we think about the buffering role of the welfare state. And then I'll just sort of entertain sort of in terms of, as a way sort of a conclusion, how that transformation of the welfare state, which is there before the crisis begins, how does it affect the ability of the welfare state to respond to the economic crisis. And I'll just sort of, I've given you that reference. This is in fact sort of a summary of a more extensive article coming out in Comparative Politics in April that is available on my website. So this is sort of what a general argument about the way that I think about the relationship between the welfare state as an intermediary between unemployment and inequality goes. We have a situation in which we have two outcomes of interest, or I'm sort of going to simplify things by looking at two outcomes: market income inequality and disposable income inequality. The reason why this makes sense is because in some ways we have a set of market outcomes when we look at market income inequality, and then we have a very sort of nice way of looking at the effect of taxes and transfers when we look at the difference between market income inequality and disposable income inequality. Unemployment, which is sort of the exogenous thing that comes here to this relationship but affects inequality, has a clear expected relationship with market income inequality, which is that it increases market income inequality because it affects these unskilled, low-paid workers more adversely than the high-skilled ones, as Abigail was mentioning sort of in her talk in the previous session. Unemployment also affects disposable income inequality in the sense that unless unemployment benefits are as generous as the previous wage, an increase in unemployment will generally be sort of connected to this increase in disposable income inequality as well. So then, essentially, the interest, sort of the project, the presentation that I'm making to you is about that relationship, but more importantly, is about the role of the welfare state in terms of intermediating and mitigating these inegalitarian effects of unemployment, both on market income inequality and on disposable income inequality. So the welfare state generosity, sort of the argument would be the welfare state generosity mitigates the first relationship, that between unemployment and market income inequality, by decreasing the incentives to accept low pay. To the degree that that's the case, then we would see a mitigation of the effects of unemployment on market income inequality. And then also the welfare state generosity minimizes the wage loss and mitigates. Again, sort of the more generous the welfare state is, the less an effect unemployment is going to have over disposable income inequality. There is a question about the direct effect of the welfare state on unemployment itself that we can talk about in terms of comments, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I don't have that much time to talk about it in the presentation right now. Furthermore, I'm also going to argue that there are sort of these two, again, sort of very rough and general sort of historical stages of the welfare state. One that is sort of generally sort of the commodifying welfare state as described by Espin Anderson. Of course, there are lots of sort of national sort of differences and sort of varieties of capitalism differences that I'm ignoring here. I'm just talking about sort of, again, sort of these general patterns that in some ways the traditional welfare state played a role, as I will show you, that was effective in controlling the inegalitarian effects of unemployment on both market income inequality and disposable income inequality. And then there is a sort of a more recent sort of workfare state, sort of one that emphasizes activation, this way sort of pushing people into employment, and this often may be sort of low-pay employment. And also attempts are made to develop or strengthen these traditional active labor market policies that will provide people with the skills that they need to get better jobs. And this is sort of both sides of this workfare or activation debate about what is going on with the welfare state. There's a side of this debate in political economy and political science that emphasizes the positive sides of this development and calls workfare sort of social investment, something that makes people more likely to look for jobs and more likely to be better skilled to get jobs. And there is a side of this that emphasizes the punitive side, the pushing people into employment and pushing people perhaps into low employment. And I'm going to sort of just look at some general sort of data to illustrate these relationships and see if there are sort of sides to this debate that are more convincing. So let me show you some data We are going to measure generosity, which is not a straightforward way. Sort of, if you remember the presentations in the previous panel, there were measures of social benefits, for example, as percentage of GDP. In some ways, the problem with those kinds of measures is that they don't have a measure of need. When unemployment goes up, then if we still spend the same amount of resources as percentage of GDP, we cannot assume that generosity is the same, because there are now more people who need those benefits and they're getting the same amount of resources. So what I'm going to do is just to, again, sort of in a very sort of rough way, look at the ratio of labor market policy to GDP over the ratio of the unemployed to the labor force. So in some ways we get a percentage of GDP spent on these active or passive or both labor market policies per percentage of unemployed unemployed people in the labor force. This is the sort of averages that you get for both sort of the side of the of labor market policy that has to do with active measures and the side that has to do with passive labor policy. This is the sort of the only graph in which I actually show the sort of cross-national differences in the kind of data that I'm using. You can look at sort of your favorite country there in that table. We're not going to pay that much attention to those cross-national differences, important and relevant as they may be. We're just going to be sort of essentially looking at the average sort of evolution of these things in general in the OECD. You can look at Germany, for example, in this graph that which shows sort of this decreasing generosity in the demanding workfare, the passive labor market policy side. Also the one in the UK, again showing this sort of general decrease in the generosity of passive labor market policies, etc. But sort of a good way to, in fact, illustrate these general patterns, since, again, I'm not interested in sort of the national differences, but sort of whether there is something common happening sort of across the OECD, I just do these very sort of simple regression models meant completely sort of for illustrative purposes, just very sort of just descriptive, instead of just sort of look at the previous table and wonder about national differences. We're going to look at the general relationship that we would obtain by looking at this cross-sectional temporal relationship in each of the countries across time and just averaging it. So in essence, I'm just doing this analysis in which I have a time effect and then country fixed effects, and that gives me the evolution of each of these policies per year as an average when averaging all the temporal variation in all the countries that I have in my sample. So what I show you here is these effects of time, and what you can see from this table is the fact that there is clearly a decrease in the generosity of passive labor market policies. That's the demanding workfare side, as we would expect. This is sort of the passive labor market policy side is getting less and less generous as time goes by. In fact, on average, over all our countries, each year is associated with this decrease of 0.004% of GDP per 1% unemployed. But also sort of what we see when we look at all these OECD countries together is that there isn't sort of a counterbalancing increase in the resources that are dedicated to active labor market policies. Because the resources on average in these countries over time are also becoming less rather than more. Again, every year is associated with a decrease in active labor market policy generosity. Again, this is not meant to be a very systematic analysis. This is not a multivariate analysis controlling for many things. This is simply meant to just describe these bivariate relationships in a way, in essence, that just averages out the things that you saw in the previous sort of table. Now, the thing that we're interested in, apart from the generosity of the welfare state, is in fact this relationship between unemployment, the welfare state as an intermediary factor, and then inequality. To make this kind of analysis, we have to sort of make this data compatible. I'm looking at this inequality data, both for market income inequality and for disposable income inequality, that is provided by the OECD, but that in fact sort of is quite related to sort of the list data, the Luxembourg income study data. And that gives us this data that is in fact divided into these two historical periods that I have defined, the decommodifying welfare state traditional period that contains three sort of time averages, the mid-80s, the 90s, the mid-90s, sort of around 1990 and the mid-90s. And then we have the more recent workforce state period, which also contains three time period averages, which have around 2000, mid-2000s, and late 2000s. And the late 2000s are 2007 to 2009, which does occupy some of the crisis, when all that I'm going to show you is in fact robust to eliminating that last sort of average, if we think that there is something sort of unusual about the crisis. Because we're using this data and because of the availability of the data, I concentrate on sort of 12 OECD countries, which are the ones that have the data that I need, and those are the 12 countries you can see there in that list: Canada, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, the UK, and the US. So again, we're just doing these simple regression models in which we just look at this bivariate relationship, just really the association between some sort of an explanatory variable and then an outcome variable. In this case, it is in fact the relationship between the generosity of labor market policy and unemployment. So this is simply to show that they're, again, sort of looking at things in this very sort of general and sort of preliminary way, there doesn't seem to be a negative effect of generosity on unemployment. The more generous the labor market policy, we don't see that more generous welfare policies are in fact associated with higher levels of unemployment. If anything, we see sort of in general a negative association that in those cases where we have more generous welfare state policy, more generous labor market policy, we have less unemployment rather than more unemployment, which makes sense sort of in terms of the measures that I'm using. The thing that really matters here, however, is this relationship between generosity and market income inequality, and whether in fact there is a difference between some sort of a stage of the welfare state before the 1990s in which we had sort of the traditional welfare state and the social investment or workfare sort of stage of the welfare state. And this is what you can see here. In these numbers, in this table, you have the relationship between the generosity of labor market policy as an aggregate, but then also separate the passive labor market side generosity and active labor market policy generosity, both in this period from 1985 to 1996, the sort of the traditional welfare state period, and the workforce state, meaning sort of this period in which we have 1992 to 2009. And what we see there is that this relationship is one that decreases market income inequality when you look at labor market policy in general in that classical sort of more traditional welfare state period, but that relationship disappears when we look at the workforce state. And this is all sort of the responsibility, particularly of active labor market policies, once we disaggregate between passive and active labor market policies. So in the first stage of this analysis, it seems that the generosity of the welfare state was associated, there was a sort of a significant difference between before workfare or before activation and now. So that effect, the egalitarian effect of the generosity of labor market policy is there before the late 1990s, but disappears after the late 1990s, so that the welfare state becomes less effective as a mitigator of the inegalitarian effect of unemployment on market income inequality. Now, the other thing that the final sort of relationship that we want to look at has to do with the relationship between unemployment and redistribution. And again, sort of the idea here is that an increase in when we go from market income inequality to disposable income inequality, that an increase in unemployment is going to be mitigated by the generosity of the welfare state. That somehow, in translating market income inequality into disposable income inequality, which is inequality after taxes and transfers, the more generous the welfare state, the more redistribution you're going to have as a difference between this disposable market inequality and market income inequality. So again, as in a previous talk in a previous panel, I'm looking at redistribution as the difference in percentage terms between disposable and market income inequality. That is what taxes and transfers are responsible for. I have an illustration there of what that means, sort of the level of redistribution in Sweden in 1992, when you have a market income inequality that is 0.374 and disposable income inequality that is 0.216, and that implies that 42% level of redistribution. Does redistribution respond to unemployment? And moreover, is there a difference between the way in which redistribution responds to unemployment before the workforce state and after the workforce state? This is what you get, again, in this sort of bivariate descriptive relationship. You see that both sort of harmonized unemployment does promote an increase in redistribution. That's what the welfare state is supposed to do. It is the case both before workfare and after workfare, but the significant thing here is that the mitigating effect of the welfare state is much less effective now than it was before, so that we see both a decrease of more than 21% in this effectiveness of redistribution as a response to unemployment after workfare, but also a less significant, statistically significant relationship, again, as an average across countries in the OECD. All right, so that's all sort of the descriptive and sort of data side of this. I have some final thoughts. How much time do I have, or am I already out of time? Okay, so I'll be very brief about this. This is really sort of just a point-by-point sort of conclusion of what I've been saying to you, or the things, the ideas that I would like you to sort of go home with. We have a sort of, inequality is frequently invoked as a sort of, as an important sort of factor affecting a number of things that we care about in politics and in political science in general, whether it is in fact electoral turnout or support for anti-democratic parties. So we very much care, or should care, about what affects inequality. One of the things that affects inequality the most is unemployment. This is something that is particularly important in a moment of crisis like now. I think that the very sort of preliminary and illustrative numbers that I've shown you show that, in fact, labor market policy, the generosity of the welfare state, has been, in fact, a very effective tool to promote equality. However, since the 1990s, this conditionality and this workfare sort of side of the welfare state has transformed benefits in a way that has made the mitigating effect of the welfare state less significant in affecting the inegalitarian effects of unemployment. So this transformation has important implications for the ability of the welfare state to promote equality, and this is particularly important in times of crisis. And we can go back to some of these things if there are questions about it, but I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Professor Rueda, for your very interesting empirical presentation. And we are now coming to the hot issue of economic inequalities per se. What has been the impact of the Great Recession on the distribution of market income and the distribution of disposable income, and what in particular has been the impact of the stabilization policies, I mean the mix of unconventionally pursued monetary easing and fiscal austerity on the distribution of income. Has the crisis acted like a large-scale shock to applied distributive justice, or has it led to the continuation and even worsening of longer-term trends towards the increasing of economic inequalities? And can a true and decisive economic recovery, if that ever happens, can it arrest and reverse those unfavorable trends? Or are the pattern and the underlying causes of inequalities almost little affected by at least regular macroeconomic fluctuations and macroeconomic policy shocks? Professor Salverda has the answers to those questions, and I would like to invite him to take the floor. Professor Salverda is Professor of Labour Market Policy and Inequality at the Amsterdam Center for Inequality Studies. He is Director Emeritus of the Amsterdam Institute for Advanced Labour Market Studies at the University of Amsterdam. He coordinated the impressive 30-country research project, the Gini Research Project on Economic Inequalities. And he's the Netherlands correspondent of the World Top Income Database, which is maintained at the Paris School of Economics. And he's now research fellow at the European Commission, working on the issue of the macroeconomic implications of the trends in income and wealth distribution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. As you notice on the screen, there's a question mark there, and it's a big question mark. Because I have a question and not necessarily the answers. It's a question mark not only because the Gini project that has been mentioned several times, in particular spelled out also by Abigail McKnight, considered a long run up to the crisis and not the crisis itself, and also this kind of data are not readily available. So Abigail showed some OECD data. I would not myself say too much about that, but I'm particularly interested, and it was also the title of the talk on the program, what will be the next situation. We know from what I will show you that there has been a lot of inequality growth before the crisis, and would there be any reason to think that that will change in the future? Now, as I'm at risk of not getting entirely to my conclusions, I start with those and first summarize a few things about what I think about a possible future development of inequality in Europe, but also in the US. So there's much to do about top income shares, top earnings in enterprise, but in my view, they're only half the story. There's a very important dimension that I hope to point out to you, which is the household dimension. That's, in my view, essential to understand the developments, particularly in labor earnings, and as a consequence in the income distribution, not only for now but for the future. And that's the issue that I will be particularly talking about. So I think that the position of dual and multiple earner households is very important in the total of what's going on in the labor market. That in a sense, this model of an individual operating in the labor market, and then you can simply look at the trade-offs for the individual and to the hiring or by the employer, on the other hand, is behind the curve, so to speak, of the developments in the household dimension. And on top of that, I think that that household dimension not only increases inequality, but might also actually feed back into inequality by means of a competitive element. Well, I mentioned a few other things. I won't have time to go over that, but for the sake of completeness, they are there. Then I think if... David Rueda and Abigail McKnight already mentioned the increase in market incomes and incomes inequality, and I'll be focusing mainly on that. But if that's increasing all the time, then redistribution will have a harder task to keep inequality of redistributed incomes at the same level. So I think there is also a dimension there that makes it more difficult to get an equal outcome in the end of disposable household incomes. I think it's also very important to realize that the single breadwinner model, that's what I'm going to show you, has disappeared to the advantage of dual earning and multiple earning, and that this makes redistribution also much more of a challenge of solidarity. Why would you be solidaristic with a single earner at the same level of earnings if you are an individual in a high-income dual earner households and you have that same level of individual earnings? So there's more of a challenge there. And also, if you find people with low earnings or either by the hour or on an annual basis in higher income households, then increasing the minimum wage or other tax credits for being in work are blunted as an instrument of redistribution, as they might actually benefit households higher up the income ladder. So I think we should look for a new social contract between, in principle, that's what we should do, between this new array of dual and multiple earner households and single earners. However, I think that will be impossible. There's no way and there's no good reason to go back to, in countries where they have individual taxation, to go back to household taxation. So given that you stick with individual taxation, it will be very difficult to redistribute that from high income but not very high earnings households towards lower earnings and lower income households. And I think the only logical conclusion in my view is that you adopt an earned income tax credit like they have roughly in the US and the UK and combine that with a minimum wage. And that we should try to do that now, that the major member state of the EU is introducing a minimum wage. Let's use that opportunity. So maybe that's an optimistic conclusion. So summarizing towards the title of this session, A Crisis of the European Project or A Crisis of Capitalism, I would say the current financial crisis, the words already tells us, it's a crisis of capitalism, not of capitalism as a model, but of the capitalist economy. And that the only way that we can cope with it is through the European project, but that so far the European project has not really been able to cope with it, and that's the challenge. So it's a double challenge in that sense, but the real crisis for now, I would say, originates in the functioning of capitalism in the recent decades. So, having given away the conclusions, I will now try to build up towards with these 3 points. So, a few things about growing inequality in the past, and then particularly to have an idea about where it will go. It's important to have an idea about the mechanism behind that, and that's what what I've mentioned as one of the important mechanisms is that demise of the single earner world. But also I think, and it has been mentioned before, we have to be very careful with the measures that we're using. So the Gini coefficient is used a lot, but when it increases, you have no idea where it comes from. That's one thing. And when it is stable, there might be a lot going on underneath that stable surface. That's very important to take into account, and that people might actually be experiencing as increased inequality, though at the aggregate level. There might be other groups that have an improved position, and the total might not change, but there might actually be very strong changes, like the intergenerational thing that has already been mentioned. So, and then I come to that future of growing inequality. So to be quick, these are the Gini. So these are annual, as far as we got them, Gini coefficients for disposable household equivalized incomes over the last 30 years. And there's a general trend, not in all countries all the time, but overall there is a general trend towards an increase in almost all the countries. So I think we can take that as a stylized effect, as many others are doing. It's important, however, to also think about the variation. So this is a natural experiment after the end of communism in Eastern Europe, and particularly highlighted are here the 3 small Baltic states. You see that they have gone on a very different trajectory. Though the end outcome might be the same, it has been very different. And at the same time as the gray lines, you can see that a country like the Czech Republic has hardly changed its level of inequality after transition. So it's not just a common shock that leads for everyone to an increase in inequality. There are institutions, but also policies that contribute. And I think that's important to realize. And that's also hidden in that spaghetti figure that I showed you before. This takes out episodes in that figure that individual countries have had during these 3 decades. And again, that aims to show that there is something to rapid sudden changes or to continuous changes in the same direction that we need to take into account, and that quite likely have to do with policy making and not just with a joint economic shock. Well, then to the mechanism of inequality growth, I mentioned the Gini coefficient. Here are 2 nice quotes from Thomas Piketty and Jan Tinbergen in particular, why the Gini is not a very good measure to help us in understanding what's going on. So I'll show you a bit more what the picture will look like if you move away from the Gini coefficient. At the same time, in these mechanisms of inequality growth and what I mentioned about the household dimension, I've called that a tale of 2 literatures. On the one hand, we have a whole literature on household income inequality. On the other hand, there's a whole literature on wage inequality. At the end, I will show you a reference of a new chapter that I've written with Daniele Checchi from Milano for the Handbook of Income Distributions, and we start with that discussion that there's 2 literatures. So we were supposed to focus on wage inequality, but also mention whether it would matter for income, the income distribution. So it's really very important to realize that. So there are a number of reasons not to rely too much on the Gini coefficient. I won't go over all of these. I've mentioned already some, but it's not only that we've got top incomes, but we also got increasing household joblessness. Households that are supposed to be in work but don't have work already well before the crisis. And it's not just a matter of unemployment, it is also a matter of not getting access to the labor market and employment at all. So these things add up to important tectonics underneath that in many cases not too large increase in inequality measured by the Gini. The tale of 2 literatures is that they not only they are separate, but they also use different measures, and I think it's very important to bridge the gap between the 2. And it's also important to realize that brings us to a situation that's very different from the single breadwinner model. In a time that, say, the vast majority of households were single breadwinner households, the distribution of their wages would be almost identical to the income distribution of those households. And that has become much more complicated now. So in that time, the labor market in a sense could care for the household because everybody in work represented a household. So for instance, in my own country, after the war, unions and employers agreed that the minimum pay should be sufficient to maintain a family. Well, that's an idea that has radically been abolished, and that is also very difficult to maintain in a dual earner household world. I skip these 2. So to demonstrate the importance of labor incomes first, as a starting point, this gives you the distribution of households whose main income is from labor earnings and where you find them in the different deciles of the income distribution. And you see that in all these European countries, except two, which I will mention in a minute, they are strongly concentrated towards the top of the income distribution. That's where you find labor households, while at the bottom there are mainly other households. So for instance, in Romania, I think only 4% of the bottom decile is a household depending on labor earnings. So the rest of the households here are households on benefit, on pensions, but also self-employed. This is households that really are getting their incomes from earnings in the labor market. Well, you will notice that Greece is at the bottom here together with Italy. And part of the explanation is certainly the high level of self-employment. But nevertheless, it's interesting to see that it's flat at a certain stage. So this is 2010, all calculated from EU Silk, the database that has been mentioned before. The World Top Income Database shows more or less the same. The increase of top incomes has gone together with an increasing role of labor incomes at the top for the few countries that we have that information. So for Greece, a question mark, but I've been in contact with some of your students or writers on the top income shares, and they're paying attention to that, but haven't published it or haven't read it. So this shows the household joblessness. I won't talk about it. This is the main thing that I would like to show you. This and the next graph. So what this graph shows you is if you look at those labor households only and you look at their incomes from earnings and rank them by the level, so you get the same 10 deciles, but now only for that group of labor households, you see how differently distributed over that earnings distribution are single earner and dual earner and multiple earner households. So single earner households are largely concentrated towards the bottom. Of the first decile, 85% of all households are single earner households. At the top, it's only 10%. This is the European average for 25 countries, or maybe 27, but there's very little difference. There is some. And this is one difference. So I drew the same picture for Greece, and you see that in Greece there is a larger role for single earner households than that European average, but at the same time you also find there dual earner household and a multiple earner household concentrating towards the top. So maybe the distribution and that larger role of single earners can also help to explain that flat profile that I showed compared to the other countries of where you find labor households over the income distribution. Now, if you then add to these households, which I just showed, the number of earners, the number of employees that they bring into the labor market, you can imagine that the weight of single earner households is dwarfed. So in the total of the European employment situation of these households, only a quarter of all employees are in single earner households, and 3/4 of them are a member of a dual earner or a multiple earner household. So that's why I say that this focus on single persons who are operating in the labor market and then hired or not hired and decide about it, that's largely outdated, and we really have to rethink that from that new situation. This is the Greek situation. Now, for a future of growing inequality, then it's not only important that we have that household dimension, but also maybe that household dimension and that strong concentration of employees in these new type of households, not so new, but certainly very important now, might be adding to the difficult situation in the labor market, particularly at the low end. That's what I will mainly focus on. So it might be a possibility. I won't be able to demonstrate it very precisely, But there is good reason to think that the joint labor earnings of these households that are at the top of the household earnings distribution, and by implication at the top of the income distribution, that they combine earnings from lower levels in the individual earnings distribution. I mentioned that, but then at the same time, the correlation between their earnings is important, but nowhere is perfect. So that means, even in the US, it's 0.6 and has increased, but that's about the only country where we have a long-run series of that correlation of earnings of partners in a household. There is still some way to go in that correlation, but also it complicates, as I mentioned, where people are, how they situate themselves, because they might be in the middle or a bit higher up or even at the bottom of the earnings distribution individually. At the same time, we also know that the incidence of individual low pay is much higher than the incidence of in-work poverty, which implies that many of these people, low-paid workers, have a presence in non-poor households. And in my view, it's possible that these dual-earner households higher up the earnings and the income distribution incorporate low-paid earners who are competing at the low-wage end of the labor market, competing there on different terms from people who are trying to find a job as a single earner household. At the same time, we have to also realize it's not just that dual earner or multiple earner households are by definition high income households and follow that kind of scenarios. No, there are also people, you see that particularly in Bulgaria and Romania, where you need to have more earners to escape poverty and not necessarily get to the top end of the income distribution. So this graph shows you where the earners in these dual and multiple earner households are relative to single earners at the same level. So mind you, if you're a single earner household in the top 10% of the distribution, that's only 1% of all those single earner households. So they are really at the top. They are individually very high paid. The other ones are much less paid. So you see the main earner here in the dual earner households, that's the round dots. They're at about 3/4, 60% to 3/4 of the level of the single earners in that same decile, and the other earners are at a lower level. This is what I mentioned already. Now, one indication that these households might, higher up the distribution, might actually be competing at lower levels is the incidence of part-time workers. And it's amazingly constant over the distribution. There's a higher incidence at the bottom, which is understandable for single earners. They will have, if you're a single part-time worker, you will certainly have low earnings. But the other ones, so dual earners, have to a large extent part-time workers, which are part of the story there. So that's one indication that to the very top you find part-time earners, and in many countries part-time employment is employment in low-wage jobs, low-wage services that care for consumers. This is the Greek picture, and even in Greece you find part-time workers in these households to the very top. I could not show with the EU Silk data for the same selection of households whether the people are low paid by the hour. So you can be low earning if you're working part-time, but you can be low earning also because you're low paid and working part-time, or low paid and working full-time. This is an indication from the previous data set, ECHP, so unfortunately that's 10 years ago, but even then you saw in these three countries, the Netherlands, Denmark and Germany, that in the top decile you find a very substantial presence of low-paid earners, so low paid by the hours. That demonstrates that there is something to that mechanism that that top income households might actually be competing for jobs at the low end, which then might go at the disadvantage of low skilled workers who would depend on those jobs for their living and to do it on a full-time basis. The poverty effect I already mentioned. So that's the main issue. Another issue, I think, is the increase in educational attainment. This is one of the other results of the Gini project, where they showed that over a whole series of cohorts. So what you find here at the bottom are the years of birth of the cohorts, and there has been a huge increase in educational attainment. This is again an EU average, and at the same time, the inequality of attainment has decreased. So we know that people are much more similarly and much better educated, but at the same time, we know that not all of them are in highly educated jobs. So particularly if you factor in that mechanism that I mentioned, that many people in high income households, or that people in higher income households might be competing in the low wage labor market, they're better educated. They trade off their other business, so that may be household care, or that may be participation in education. They trade it off against the conditions of work in these low wage jobs. So they like to do it part-time, and because they work in part-time, their high payout of net pay will be higher than for a full-time worker, and they might also do this on different conditions. So there's, to the extent that competition exists, it's also pretty fierce. So I think that for the future, if we think about that, and I repeat in a sense what I said at the start, there is more than just the top income shares. There's also an increasing role for that household dimension and for the potential competition that it means for others. So this is what I've mentioned. Here's some further reading, and I thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, I'm afraid. We are now turning our attention to one of the most unpleasant aspects of the current European predicament, namely the emergence, or in fact, the growth in the number of the working poor. So far as I know, economic research on the issue has not been that much developed, and I mean, problems of definition and identification of those working poor are not sorted out. But in the European Union, we're having a working definition. And research has been lacking also on the influence of macroeconomic, institutional, social, or demographic factors on the phenomenon. And importantly, research is lacking on the labor market and the broader macroeconomic effects of the working poor phenomenon. In fact, Janet Yellen asked for more research on that subject during her last speech at Jackson Hole. But Professor Monastiriotis has set himself a relevant research question, and very provocative indeed. He wonders whether the working poor are not just a symptom of the crisis, but they are instead a source of the competitive, or should I say the comparative advantage of nations. And I'm switching to Greek for 2 seconds, and for very obvious reasons. Ο Βασίλης Μοναστηριώτης είναι αναπληρωτής καθηγητής πολιτικής οικονομίας στο Ευρωπαϊκό Ινστιτούτο του London School of Economics. Είναι μέλος στο Ελληνικό Παρατηρητήριο. Διευθύνει την ερευνητική μονάδα για την Νότια Ευρώπη. Έχει γράψει πολλά πράγματα και είναι συνεπιμελητής έκδοσης, συνεπιμελητής του Spatial Economic Analysis. Θα λέω σωστά? Ναι. Το αστείο του πράγματος είναι ότι με το Βασίλη γνωριζόμαστε σήμερα εκ του σύνεγγυς, έχοντας συνεργαστεί στο παρελθόν σε μια συλλογική έκδοση για τα 10 χρόνια της Νομισματικής Ένωσης, όπου, αν θυμάμαι, εκείνος, μιλώντας για τις μεταρρυθμίσεις στην αγορά εργασίας και εγώ θεωρητικολογώντας, είχαμε καταλήξει περίπου σε κοινό συμπέρασμα. Εντάξει, αλλά δεν ήμασταν και τρελαμένοι από ευτυχία, αν θυμάμαι καλά. Οκ, Βασίλη.
Λοιπόν, καλησπέρα σας, θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά. So let me start by thanking the organizers and the Crisis Observatory for organizing this event and for inviting me here. Professor Kouchiaras said that I set myself this topic for presentation. Actually, this topic was kindly offered to me by the organizers, and I have to say that this is not really my area of expertise, so part of the presentation will be on things that I approached as a student just in the last few weeks when trying to study the topic of in-work poverty, and I will try to put towards the end some of the things that I teach my students about some of the things that I claim to know a bit better, but not so, not absolutely to the best of knowledge. So at the end, I hope to be able to say something useful about this sub-question about if poverty in general is a symptom of the crisis or the new comparative advantage, low pay and poverty. I'm going to have 3 parts, although the first part is a very, very long introductory part that I'll skim through quite quickly. First, what do we know? What do we think we know? And what do we know about inequality, poverty, and about in-work poverty in particular? I have the disadvantage not only that I'm a recent student on the topic, but also that I follow the presentation of Professor Salveda, so many of the things that I was planning to say have been covered better and earlier, but I'll try to differentiate a bit. Then I will look at the issues that come from the literature and very much from the work around the Gini project and elsewhere about in-work poverty in particular. What are the causes of that, but also what are the factors that contribute? Where is in-work poverty to be found? And I'll add a bit more detail from things you've seen before. And then towards the end, I will look at this broader question about the crisis of capitalism. Professor Kouchiaras at the beginning mentioned the crisis of democratic capitalism. Is this a historical parenthesis, or is it something that we will carry with us in the years ahead? So I'll try again to say something intelligent on that. So let me start by telling you a very, very simplified story of what brought us here on the issue of rising inequality and in-work poverty. And this has to do from a departure from a nice world where everything was fine under Keynesianism and the social contract, the Bretton Woods Compromise and everything else. We had demand management by the state, which kind of guaranteed full employment or tried to guarantee full employment, and in that sense, income security. And we had an extensive welfare state, generalizing, of course, but in many respects, an extensive welfare state that provided benefits transfers to treat the unemployed, so to provide income security to the unemployed. And all this changed with a neoliberal turn, call it monetarism, call it neoliberalism or what have you. We have the retrenchment of the welfare state, which erodes the support to the unemployed. We have the program of labor market flexibility that came out of the 80s from the OECD, and we have increasing lower work intensities or underemployment, which again lead to income insecurity, and of course more recently also in relation to the politics of austerity, so in relation to the crisis we have a reduction in pay levels and then the emergence of working poor related to that. So inequality and in-work poverty has in a way to do with all these trends of as David Rueda mentioned, the commodification of the welfare state, but also the welfare state retrenchment, increasing flexibility. So I will start by looking at pictures of inequality and flexibility. I'm quite doubtful about the accuracy of these pictures, although I'm in a small minority, I think. So we know, everybody knows nowadays the pictures produced by the Paris School of Economics and Piketty and co-authors about the reversal of the trend of declining inequality. So historical rates of inequality have been declining in the US, Canada, in the UK, but the picture has been reversed since the late 70s, and we have a resurgence of the the pay of the top 1% relative to everybody else. And this is not unique to democratic capitalism. It's also a characteristic of undemocratic capitalism, like in China. So we have, again, an increase in inequality there. And this also applies to other places, like in the south. This is Portugal. I think that is Spain. I cannot really look. But it doesn't apply everywhere. So we have here Germany, France, Netherlands, Denmark, and other places where inequalities haven't been rising so dramatically. So the picture is not so universal as we'd like to think. The other thing which I'm more familiar with is what comes from labor economics and international trade, labor economics, concerning employment and wage polarization. So the other thing we know about patterns, global patterns in terms of inequality, is that we have a pattern of polarization, the so-called disappearing middle. And this concerns both wage polarization, so wages are growing faster. This is a quite dated picture from the US, but that's all we know about the topic. Wages are growing faster at the top of the distribution, but also at the bottom of the distribution, and you have this kind of disappearing middle where there's wage stagnation, if you want, for the middle class. And this also contributes, of course, to inequality. And this has survived also in the period this survives also in terms of different definitions. The other dimension to that is employment polarization, which I think is in some ways more important. What this says is that we have a faster employment growth at the high wage occupations and also faster employment growth at the very low wage occupations, and then the middle is not growing. So the middle classes, perhaps people like you and me in this audience, are losing out. The very well-off are going upwards, and the very worse off are increasing the proportion in the economy. And this also contributes to inequality. So low-wage occupations rising faster than middle-wage occupations. And again, this also survived the crisis. This is a picture for 2011, 2012. However, we also know that this is not, again, universal, like the picture of inequality. So you get that in some countries like the Netherlands, France, maybe Germany, but not in other countries. Spain doesn't have a polarization curve. Italy doesn't have a polarization curve, and so forth. Also, Greece, in this work, is classified as an upgrading economy, although I don't know where that belongs. So we know there's a rise in inequality, we know there's employment polarization which contributes to inequality, but it's not so clear that this applies everywhere, that this is a global trend, either in relation to the crisis or in relation to capitalism at large. The other thing we think we know is, again, also the declining share of labor, the declining labor share to total GDP, to total incomes. And these are, again, pictures of declining labor share. So capital is gaining a bigger portion of what is produced every year in the global economy and in particular countries. And you can see the picture. There's also a recent publication on wage-led growth, which very much talks about these issues. But also here, these are very misleading statistics, or potentially misleading statistics, because they do not tell us about the alternative incomes of people associated with salaried labor. So how much of wages are contributing to total income of people in employment, yeah? In relation to rents, in relation to profit sharing, in relation to asset holding, and also to benefits. I'm skimming through. So again, some question marks. We think we know there's all these negative trends. Also in terms of flexibility, we know flexibility, flexible employment, irregular employment and so forth have increased very much since the 70s. But actually, if we look at the data, and this is Eurostat data here, for example, on part-time employment, you can see that there's very minor increases between 2004 and 2013, also including the crisis. There are some countries where the bigger increases than in other places, but the increases are not so dramatic. What is more dramatic is the country differences. Okay, so if you compare the Netherlands, for example, with Greece, somewhere, you know, these differences are much more sizable than the differences over time. And similar things apply to temporary employment, limited duration contracts, and all the different measures we have of irregular employment and flexible employment. So the point here is that we have some trends, but also a lot of variation within the different patterns that we see. So I am a bit doubtful about the accuracy of the prediction that we have a universal rise in inequalities. Now, the other thing that I wasn't very sure is, of course, the extent of in-work poverty. And I came to look at information about the incidence of low pay and whether in-work poverty is on the rise. And I thought that's a very nice topic to present on. I will find huge increases of in-work poverty, and then I will come in with the explanations, but it didn't work quite like that. First of all, with the crisis, or just before the crisis, we don't have any marked increase, compare the yellow and the blue lines, in the incidence of low pay in relative terms. So relative low pay has not increased. And again, the country differences in many places are bigger than the temporal variation. This is Eurostat data, so it's not my fault if the data is not accurate. In-work poverty, you can see these maps in different EU publications and elsewhere, which using the red color and stuff, and it's quite alarming. You see the whole of the South, very high levels of in-work poverty, also the East, some places. But actually, if you look at the numbers and the trends, there's a very different story. So even in Greece, according to Eurostat, the Eurostat measure of in-work poverty, we have 10% of people in employment are classified in impoverished households, which is almost half or less than half of what is for the general population. So, it is a problem, of course, but it's not nearly as big a problem as out-of-work poverty. And also, if you look at the trends, I don't see much of a trend. There's more cyclical variation, if anything. So I didn't find something that was really telling me that there is a significant in-work poverty problem. So then, and actually from some older publications concerning data for 99, what we can see here is that the employed poor are really a small fraction of total poor. The unemployed poor and the self-employed poor are much more. So the incidence of poverty for the unemployed and the self-employed is much greater than for the in-work, than people in employment. And these are all things that you've looked at also before. So what does the literature say about that? First of all, there is the problem of measurement. Also, Chrisa in the previous panel discussed about that. How do we know how we measure it? Actually, different countries have different definitions. This is just to intimidate the audience and say that there's different definitions on in-work poverty. Basically, what the literature argues is that we have two trends that contribute to in-work poverty. One is the things that we talked about, deindustrialization, globalization, skilled bias, technological change, employment polarization that I mentioned earlier, all the things that contribute to worse economic conditions and less worker power for the employed. So pressures for low wages and precarious employment, and also much of economic adjustment coming through labor and labor incomes rather than through profits. The other interesting thing, however, that the literature identifies is that a lot of in-work poverty has to do with activation policies. So as we bring more people into the labor market, these normally tend to be less qualified, less skilled people. You could think that people rank themselves, queue from the most qualified who gets the first job to the least qualified, which is the last person to be employed. Okay, things don't work exactly like that in reality, but you can think of that idea. And then the more people you bring into employment, these are going to be less productive, less qualified, naturally lower paid workers. And also by reducing unemployment, you artificially increase median incomes, so there's a statistical effect that increases in-work poverty, even if there's no underlying causal mechanism creating that. So these are interesting observations. The other observations in that slide are already made. In-work poverty is not, from the data and the analysis also in relation to the Gini project, related to low pay as such, but mainly to single earner households, exactly what Professor Alvera was mentioning before, and also low work intensities, part-time employment, part-year employment, and so forth. Actually, from what we know, the interaction of employment, low pay, and poverty accounts for less than 10% of the working age population. So we're not talking about a significant proportion of the population. Most low-paid workers are members in multiple earner households, so then it is not a poverty problem. As I mentioned before, also the question is whether the working poor are a real problem, given how big a problem the non-working poor are. Yes, so if you really care about poverty and about material deprivation, why not focus on the unemployed and those out of work, excluded from work, rather than look at the in-work part of the population? There's questions there, of course, of underpay, undervalue, and underemployment, but also you can see employment as a stepping stone, as a part of socialization. We know also from the happiness literature, the subjective well-being literature, that being able to participate in productive work makes you happier sometimes. So it is not very clear, again, why we should focus on in-work poverty. Issues of measurement, the levels of analysis, how you bring the individual earner to the corresponding household on which you calculate poverty rates have been discussed before, but there are also, of course, things that you can look at in the literature. This, I thought somebody would use, someone of the previous presenters would use before me, but I'm the first one to copy from an early European Foundation publication. It shows exactly this problem, that you have at the individual level somebody who may be in poverty or may not, but then at the household level they may be moving on outside poverty because a partner in the household or another earner in the household has a higher income, or you could be on a high or decent wage, but as a household, because you have many dependents, for example, you're under the poverty line. And of course, even outside the household, what matters is what the state does in redistributing and pushing people out of poverty through benefits. So all this goes to say that in-work poverty is a very complicated issue. Now, I have many, many pictures and tables that I can show you to communicate this point, but I think we're a bit pressed with time, so I will move on and not discuss most of these things. I just want to present that, which gives you the incidence of income poverty, so poverty, for people at full year employment, with a distinction between the high paid, let's say, and not low paid and low paid. And you can see that, of course, people on kind of high wages or average and high wages have very low income poverty probabilities, but there are variations across countries. Also variations across countries are for the very low paid, the incidence of poverty for the very low paid. Compare here the Netherlands with other Netherlands and Belgium with other countries like Luxembourg is an outlier, but also Lithuania and so forth. But even within countries, that's 7% for Belgium, which says out of the low-paid earners, only 7% live in impoverished households. Even within there, the percentage is around 2% for people who live in multiple earner households, and it is 28% for people who live in single earner households. So again, the point made earlier that single earning situation is really a key contributor to household poverty, again, comes out from the data. As I promised, many pictures that I'm not going to talk to you about. So what I want to talk to you about then is capitalism and crisis. Now, a starting point would be to look at what is the impact of capitalism, globalization, and of the crisis. The crisis has affected, of course, incomes through this kind of double deleveraging situation, where the public sector, the governments are trying to reduce their indebtedness, and then they cut down on benefits, they cut down on public employment, public wages, and so forth, so budgetary austerity, but also the private sector deleveraging in the sense of trying to reduce its own indebtedness, which leads to lower demand, wage compression, and lower incomes, especially for the low-skilled. On top of that, we have this kind of competitive pressure for adjustment to correct our current account imbalances, which again creates pressures for what we call internal devaluation, so reducing wages in order to maintain or increase competitiveness. And interestingly, although we would talk about globalization in very different terms, we would think about routinization, skill bias, technological change, migration, and how it creates a race to the bottom. Also, the inability of combining, the impossibility of combining fixed exchange rates with capital mobility, how it means that your exchange rate is essentially your inflation rate, so you have to keep wages low in order to avoid wage push inflation. Interestingly, very different kind of explanation story, but exactly the same outcome. So pressures for internal devaluation. In econometrics, we call this kind of observational equivalence. You have two explanations that produce the same outcome. You cannot identify the causal effect between the two things. Moving on to my conclusion, I want to bring then two things that I tell my students about, which comes from political science, political economy discussion. Two contributions, quite different contributions, that talk about the impossibility of democratic capitalism. You cannot have capitalism and democracy simultaneously, and this goes beyond the crisis. On the one hand, Wolfgang Streeck, talking about the crisis and the double deleveraging being that place where we have the end of forward resource pooling. So the idea is that in the past we could generate inflation that would allow us to generate incomes that we then redistribute. Then we had indebtedness that allowed governments to redistribute and maintain the welfare state. Game over, we don't have anything like that anymore. At last, Streeck says, the inconsistency of democratic capitalism has reached its limit. Why? Because we have this preference, the political preference for globalization and so forth. Danny Roderick, in a very different environment, talks about the end of the Bretton Woods Compromise, the end of managing globalization. And what he identifies there is that if you want to maintain your state and your welfare state, then your national competences and economy, then you have to engage in fiscal consolidation, internal devaluation. Essentially, then, what you have is a conflict between moving on politically to the global arena and trying to manage globalization through global governance, or becoming more and more insular, trying to maintain and preserve your nation state. And this is a big contradiction, which is a challenge for everybody. Now, I think this doesn't translate into the problems that we think we see. So I think, despite what we also heard earlier from David Rueda, the welfare state is quite sticky, it persists. Yes, we have a reduction in sort of benefits and support, but actually we have still a lot of welfare state. If you go from here to Thailand, you will realize that we have a very strong welfare state. If you go not so far away, but also if you go to the United States, you may realize that we do have quite a resilient welfare state. Also, if you look at wage growth, I think it's a very interesting picture. We talk about internal devaluation and how growth has been sort of de-linked from output growth has de-linked from wage growth. Now, in the years of the crisis, you can see, obviously, there is a positive relationship between wage growth and output growth. This is not a surprise. Output, a part of output is wages, so there would be a positive correlation. But actually, what you can see is that in most countries, on the left of this blue line, wage growth was faster than output growth. So even if you think about fiscal consolidation and the redistribution from labor to capital, it is not so easy to see where this is coming from. So you have many examples where wages increase faster than output. The problem is that the question is whose wages? Yeah. So is it the wages of you and me? Is it the wages of the working poor? Or is it the wages of the top 1% or top 0.5%? But then I think that, and I'm sort of moving to the conclusions, then this means that what we have here is not a problem of capitalism, it's not a problem of globalization, it's not a problem of some sort of exogenous technological change that makes everything impossible and undemocratic. What is there is a problem of policy, of how do you translate this wage growth into equitable wage growth, on how you allow work to be meaningful and rewarding. So finding new policies, for example, in relation to in-work poverty, new policies to address the new problems, the emerging problems of multiple learner households, as we saw earlier, of very low paid for the sons and the daughters of the very high paid, and how you deal with this competition for the really unskilled and the really insecure. And also in relation to austerity politics, find the ways to bring in this growth, to create this growth that can then allow redistribution for the welfare state. The welfare state is feeling the pressure partly because our growth rates are not at the level where they should be. So I'm now, do I have another couple of minutes, maybe? Yeah? 1 minute, okay. Okay, so by means of a conclusion, is there a problem? I think direct measures of inequality are more relevant. Inequality is something that we feel directly in relation to others, and it creates problems that run across. It creates problems of legitimacy, it creates problems in the housing market, it creates problems of access to education and all different resources. Issues of security are also more important. It doesn't matter so much if a particular person finds themselves into poverty in a particular point in time. The question is more whether the person can get in and out of poverty, or the question is whether the person feels that they don't have to worry about poverty so that they can make the right investment or other decisions. If we care about low pay, this is a labor market issue. We should worry about it in labor market terms. Why do we have low productivity jobs that then necessitate low wages? It is not an issue of poverty. Poverty is a separate issue, although there are questions about justice. I skip this, and I'm very, very quickly concluding. So this is, if you want, my main message, that what we really need to focus is our labor markets policies, fix the labor market to create meaningful work and productive employment. If you have high productivity jobs, you will not have low pay jobs and low paid employees. And also to fix our welfare state. David Rueda and others have talked about the challenges that the welfare state is facing. Try to find a way to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the welfare state, including through its targeting, but at the same time maintain and re-legitimize the issues of the dimension of solidarity of the welfare state to provide the safety nets where it is needed. And in order to do that, my final words, in order to do that, you have to, in a way, really create a more efficient way of targeting the really needy. And I think looking at inward poverty in a way is a distraction. It is like asking, why is it that 50% of the poor or 20% of the poor are left-handed? You know, some people are left-handed, so some poor people would also be left-handed. It doesn't necessarily follow that being left-handed makes you more likely to be poor. Maybe we have to address poverty on the one hand, and any possible discrimination to the left-handed as a separate issue, but not as joint issues. Thank you.
Βασίλη, ευχαριστώ πολύ. Up to this point, there's been a certain mismatch between the titles and the actual content of the presentations. It's nobody's fault. It has been reflected in my introductory comments. But this is not going to happen this time, because the organizers had sent me the paper on which Professor Smith's presentation is based, and I did my homework. So I know that Professor Smith is going to talk about the possibility to attain a sustainable and inclusive growth in Europe. What it means and what it takes in terms of resources, policies, and institutions. And in particular, Professor Smith is going to answer whether that will necessitate some change in the allocation of tasks between the community and resources, between the community institutions and the member states. So, Professor Smith, you have the floor. Let me say that Professor Smith has been Professor of Political Economy at the Free University of Berlin. He's also Emeritus Director of the Research Unit Labour Market Policy and Employment at the Social Science Research Center of Berlin. He published, among other things, two great books, the International Handbook for Labour Market Policy and Evaluation and Full Employment in Europe, Managing Labour Market Transitions and Risks. And he was a member of various advisory committees, in particular, the committee preparing the German labour market reform under Chancellor Schroeder. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear organizers, thank you so much for this challenging question. Sustainable inclusive growth, is it still possible? I don't know. So I could stop here. I hope you are still ready, and especially I hope that I can a little bit return the melancholic attitude which came out of the last discussion, especially of my colleague Wolfgang Streeck, who is very pessimistic about the development. So, inclusion is one of the key buzzwords for our times. Obviously, it appeals to a very high value, but its meaning is not precise. However, instead of struggling with definition, I tell you a story and narrative. A couple of years ago, the conservative libertarian coalition in Germany repeatedly lost elections at the Länder level. Why? An opinion poll presented a survey as one of possible explanations. Would you prefer more growth or more equal opportunity? 40% prefer more growth, however 48% prefer more equal opportunity. Obviously, Germany had a problem of social inclusion, despite an apparent job wonder. The current conservative social democratic government seems to have understood that lesson. It just introduced a national minimum wage. 10 years ago, this would have been impossible. A national minimum wage is an inclusive benchmark. It forces the government to be aware of different competitivenesses and to do something for those for whom the benchmark is not accessible. In other words, to make a national minimum wage sustainable, economic and social policy has to care for solidarity measures, either to compensate the losers or, preferably, to level the playing field and to develop the capacities of prospective losers to be able to jump over the benchmark. I'm not sure whether the German government has understood that message and the implications, and I have some doubts whether it succeeds to implement the required complementary policies to make the national minimum wage an important element of sustainable, inclusive growth. We have to wait and see. At the European level, the introduction of the common currency in 1998 corresponds to the minimum wage example. It completely changed the rules of the game. But in this case, we don't have to wait anymore. We already experienced the fact that Europe did not succeed to implement the necessary solidaric policies to compensate the losers. And Europe failed in particular in leveling the playing field to make the new rules a fair game for all members of the Eurozone. And let me briefly illustrate this with some figures. The table compares the performance of the Eurozone, EU17, with the total European Union, and the performance of Greece with Germany. I draw your attention only to the last column, which depicts the changes or change rates from 2005 to 2012. As you can see, the Eurozone performs consistently worse than the total European Union, which means even worse when the Eurozone would have been compared with the rest of the European Union. The differences, however, are much more drastic between Greece and Germany. GDP per capita increased in Germany by 14.2%, and declined in Greece by 12.5%. The employment rate increased in Germany by 7.3% and percentage point, and declined in Greece by 9.3 percentage point. The differences in unemployment rates are even more dramatic, which we have heard already a couple of times in the morning, in the early afternoon. When we look at indicators closer to inclusive growth, to social inclusion, we see again that the Eurozone performed worse than the rest of Europe. Poverty risk, material deprivation, and income inequality increased faster. In Germany, the risk of poverty increased even faster than in Greece, albeit at a lower level. Material deprivation went up in Greece by 6.7 percentage points, in Germany only by 0.3 percentage points. Income inequality got worse in Greece. more than in Germany and at a much higher level. The only exception is the gender wage gap. Greece performed much better than Germany. Misery is a great equalizer of gender relationships. This is certainly not the way we would like to have it. Why is it so? And can this development be turned around? My message is in principle yes, but the requirements for such a turnaround are tremendous. Let me explain this by a little model. The vertical axis represents a measurement for economic inclusion, which I call comparable productive capacity. The members of our monetary union must have a minimal amount of comparable productive capacity. For instance, accumulative productive capital, inbuilt stabilizers, a skilled workforce, a supportive infrastructure, reliable rules of law, an effective tax system, an efficient and incorruptible administration. I cannot go into the details here, and I will just touch two examples for the sake of illustration. With respect to administrative capacities, studies have shown that bureaucracy costs are about 6.8% of GDP in Greece, while the EU average is 3.5%. With respect to taxing capacities, it is not only the issue of mobilizing enough taxes for the financing of public goods, in other words, to get tax avoidance under control. It is also the issue of setting the right incentives at the right places. Where have you the taxing power? And I understand from comparative research that those countries in which the regions and the municipalities have an own taxing power do much better in terms of innovation and creation of jobs. And as far as I understand that in Greek, the municipality leaders are excluded from business returns produced in the municipality, reducing thereby their interest in caring for a good local business climate. The horizontal axis is a measurement for economic flexibility. In other words, the ability to cope with external shocks through flexible exchange rates, flexible wages, variable employment contracts, and regional mobility. There's a trade-off between those two dimensions. A lack of comparable productive capacity has to be balanced out by increased flexibility. Otherwise, the state will run into unsustainable debts, unemployment will increase, and so on. In order to illustrate this, I have depicted the possible situation of a few countries. Germany and the Netherlands lie above the line. Ireland and Greece are on the line, each presenting different trade-off constellations. The introduction of the euro has caused this line to move upwards. The demands for comparable productive capacity have grown due to increased competition and the loss of currency sovereignty. Although Germany and the Netherlands might now find themselves directly on the line, they have already moved downwards when it comes to more flexibility. Ireland and Greece are now both clearly below the line. Although measures of flexibilization have already been implemented, they would have to go much further than in Germany or the Netherlands compared with the productive capacity. This would be unacceptable for the majority of the population, in particular for workers. Democracy would become endangered, and Europe could break apart. What are the alternatives? Macroeconomic measures, of course, that have already been embraced but not yet sufficiently implemented. For example, a European banking union or a huge investment program into the European infrastructure such as energy, transport, sewage, information and communication technology. I have to leave this point and to turn to more structural and institutional remedies. The model depicts 4 general strategies which would have to be combined to support sustainable inclusive growth. First, investive social transfers could push the trade-off line downwards, hence relieving member states below the line from taking further recourse to intolerable flexibility measures. Second, the lack in productive capacities could be compensated by measures of protected flexibility, which would also respond to increasing demands for flexibility from the supply side. Third, reproductive capacities could be improved by investing in people. It would also simultaneously raise the capacity of flexibility. Fourth, productive capacities could be lifted by efficient labor market regulation to ensure a better utilization of existing capacities by reducing, for instance, inefficient flexibility, like excessive use of fixed-term contracts, by setting high-quality standards in working conditions and supporting horizontal and vertical mobility. Let me use the remaining time to present a few examples for the discussion. Investive social transfers between the EU member states are nothing new. The European Social Fund is one example. I think this fund could be redirected in a more effective way towards capacity building, in particular by enhancing member states' unemployment insurance systems and employment services. First of all, the Commission should ensure a more visible demonstration of the ESF added value. May I be wrong, but I'm not aware of any integrated meta-evaluation that provides a persuasive narrative that the social Europe already exists in nucleus. Each year, the expenditures for the European Social Fund are 10 billion euro at least. Moreover, making social Europe more visible and persuasive is also a matter of framing. In other words, the EU 2020 strategy should make much clearer that short-term unemployment benefits are not passive, but active investments into productive job search and supporting structural change. This is so important. I think David Rueda has provided a very excellent material that unemployment benefits may be productive. Second, unemployment insurance is not only a powerful institutional device for fair risk sharing, which means compensating the losers ex post and rising contributions of the winners ex ante. It's very important to have a redistributive capacity ex ante, but also a powerful institutional device for an automatic economic stabilizers. Labor market information, training, and targeted employment subsidies effectively reduce long-term unemployment. This framing should encourage the Commission to retarget ESF resources towards labor market services and social dialogue capacities. Also, relaunch of the open method of coordination and its instruments like the Social Protection Performance Monitor should be envisaged. This should be accompanied by an aggressive marketing of this method as an effective instrument for deepening the European Union without affecting member states' sovereignty. Second, there are good reasons to establish a rudimentary system of European employment insurance. Its core would be a European unemployment insurance. However, the model that I suggest differs from the proposal of the former EU Commissioner Laszlo Andor. He suggested a uniform European unemployment insurance, emphasizing short-term unemployment and the stabilization function instead of the protection function of insurance. I think this goes in the wrong direction, and in particular, I see no chance of realization. My proposal suggests to take the United States federal system of unemployment insurance as a starting model and to adjust this model to the European social standards and insights of modern labor economics. Following the US model would ensure a genuine European fiscal capacity and minimum standards by regarding at the same time national sovereignty in determining the rules and implementation. Moreover, the United States system is based on social insurance principles that have at least 5 advantages compared to flat rate and means-tested benefits. Insurance-related benefits can be calculated much more easier and fairer than means-tested flat rates. They are better protected against discretionary political decisions than benefits from general taxation. The incentives to work are much stronger due to the entitlement effect. The stabilization impact is higher due to higher benefits and coverage. And jobless people, there are studies about serious econometric studies, jobless people covered by decent unemployment insurance remain healthier and more self-confident than jobless people without unemployment insurance and only means-tested benefits. The launch of a European unemployment insurance would certainly require a change in the EU treaties. But in short term, the European Council and Commission could consider to establish an experimental fund for providing credits to member states whose unemployment exceeds a certain threshold. Another possibility would be extended benefits to co-financed 50% by the EU and 50% by the member states. The transfers could be made conditional on training or use guarantees and aggressive wage cost subsidies in favor for long-term unemployed. It was Nicholas Calder, an intellectual contemporary of Lord Keynes, who argued a long time ago, if employment cannot be boosted through devaluating the currency, then massive temporary wage subsidies can be used as a functional equivalent. And this is very important for youth who need urgently work experience and building up networks with firms and things like that. The next point is, and the last, protected flexibility would both complement the increasing demand for flexibility on the product market side and the increasing demand for life course flexibility on the supply side of the labor market. This requires, first of all, that the EU flexicurity strategy puts more emphasis on securing internal flexibility within the companies. The flexicurity strategy has emphasized too much external flexibility, mobility, etc. There are two main reasons for this, to emphasize more internal flexibility. First, companies as well as employees are interested in ensuring mutual human and social capital investments. Second, spatial mobility becomes restricted through the increasing number of multi-employees households. If one accepts these framework conditions, then the extension of unemployment insurance towards employment insurance would be the next logical step. A paradigmatic example for protected flexibility is short-time work allowance as an institutional device for fair risk sharing. It protects employment stability through temporarily reducing working hours and compensates the loss of income of reduced working hours by unemployment insurance. In this way, workers trade in some wage flexibility for job security, and employers trade in some fixed wage costs for workers' loyalties and the maintenance of skills. During the last recession, this instrument was successfully implemented in many member states, especially in Germany. The German example also shows a number of other effective possibilities for protected flexibility, which can be negotiated by the social partners on the level of industrial branches of firms, for instance, working time accounts, wage corridors, demographic funds. Governments can support such negotiated flexibility in various ways, for instance, by ensuring that accumulated individual entitlements are portable in case of companies' bankruptcy or in case of job-to-job transitions. Further examples are hedging income risk during further training or retraining by providing training vouchers, or hedging income risk during leaves of parenting, taking care of sick family members, or for sabbaticals. Non-standard employment becomes increasingly standard. It would therefore be a distinct task of the European Social Union to further develop and maintain mutual standards of social protection, such as the right to return from part-time work into an equivalent full-time job. Often the legal framework for such protection is available, but effective implementation is hampered by the lack of procedural securities and control. I think a new directive for flexible jobs would be helpful, and relaunching the OMC, or Open Method of Coordination, could enhance efficient implementation. Such a relaunch should encourage member states to establish binding procedures of control according to the administrative culture, for instance, work inspectors, legally endorsed collective agreements, or administrative agreements like the regional employment pacts or covenants in many member states. To give the open method of coordination more bite, one could follow Fritz Scharf's proposal of differentiated framework directives between consenting groups of member states, or not all member states, but consenting group of member states could develop this kind of protective flexibility for flexible jobs. Final examples are wage insurance for workers who have to make the transition into possibly lower paid jobs as a result of reduced earnings capacities. For example, targeted in-work subsidies for workers whose earning capacity is temporarily restricted due to care obligations, and for workers who accept temporarily involuntary part-time as screening device for a full-time job. So for shortage of time, I leave the next examples and conclude with, and you can read this in a longer paper as a background paper available of this presentation. So let me stop here with one final remark. I remember an interview with, in one German newspapers with the great Greek poet Kiki Dimoulas. She was asked, what do you connotate with the term Europe? And she spontaneously answered, rescue from the loneliness of individual states. But what we seem to experience now is the opposite. And I hope I have contributed a little bit to the rescue image of Europe. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith. I can see queues, but we're having time for 4 questions only. So, who's going to ask?
Λοιπόν, λέγομαι Ελένη. Καλησπέρα. Τώρα θέλω να σας πω μία διαπίστωση από μία πηγή που έχω για την Ελλάδα και μετά να βάλω μια ερώτηση. Λοιπόν, η Ελλάδα είναι πρώτη στην εμπορική ναυτιλία παγκοσμίως. Λοιπόν, με 2.500 φορτηγά πλοία και δεξαμενόπλοια και πέμπτη παγκοσμίως η Κύπρος. Λοιπόν, η Ελλάδα είναι πρώτη στην Ευρώπη στις ελιές και τρίτη στην Ευρώπη στα ροδάκινα και τα κτηνίδια. Λοιπόν, η Ελλάδα είναι πρώτη παγκοσμίως σε μέταλλα, βοξίτη, ψευδάργυρο, λιγνίτη και σε πολλά άλλα. Λοιπόν, επίσης, η Ελλάδα έχει το μεγαλύτερο κοίτασμα πετρελαίου παγκοσμίως.
Λίγο να συντομεύσετε,
ναι.
Και ας μην φύγουμε από το θέμα μας.
Εντάξει, όχι, στο θέμα μας είμαστε.
Ας πούμε.
Ναι.
Ευχαριστώ.
Λοιπόν, πρώτη παγκοσμίως σε κοίτασμα πετρελαίου νοτίως της Κρήτης, με 38 δις περίπου αξίας, και πρώτη σε εξόρυξη χρυσού στη Μακεδονία, παγκοσμίως επίσης. Η ερώτηση είναι, ποιος ψάχνει δουλειά και δεν βρίσκει?
Ήθελα να κάνω μία ερώτηση σε κάθε έναν από τους συνομιλητές μας εδώ και εφόσον υπάρχει χρόνος να απαντηθεί, αλλιώς μπορούμε και στο κομμάτι της... Professor Ueda, is the causality chain linking generosity to levels of unemployment out of criticism? Is there room for second thoughts and revisions? Professor Salverda, unemployment and inequality are only statistically expressed at the individual level. So in what ways could we consider household earnings in relation to collective capabilities and regional welfare? Professor Monastiriotis, considering in-work poverty related to self-employment, what are your insights for Greece? Is this linked to the persistent suboptimal capitalization of small Greek family enterprises? And last but not least, Professor Schmidt, on investive social transfers, as you mentioned, how to transform family income into seed capital.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman over there.
Good evening. I'd like to make first a statement and then a question following the statement. I study economics, and I noticed that nowadays the economic science stopped presenting a vision, an alternative vision of how things should be. We're focusing on analyzing things, and we focus on finding the focus where to just on what to analyze. But a question, what will follow capitalism? Do you think that capitalism will just evolve into the ultimate economic system? I mean, the market helps us distribute the resources effectively, but it is not just. It's a fact that Germany gets richer and Greece gets poorer. It's a fact that rich people get richer and poor people get poorer by the use of market. We need a state in order to equalize things. Can we just evolve this into a system that distributes the resources effectively and just at the same time? Thank you.
The last question.
Ναι, καλησπέρα. Το όνομα μου είναι Τσαρκάνης Νίκος, φοιτητής, και θα ήθελα να ρωτήσω τον κύριο Μοναστηριώτη, ο οποίος αναφέρθηκε για τη μεσαία αστική τάξη, αν πιστεύει ότι είναι αποτέλεσμα της κρίσης, η μείωσή της, ή αν πιστεύει ότι είναι παράγοντας που οδήγησε στην κρίση. Ευχαριστώ.
And the last one, Mr. Kamaras.
My question is to Professor Schmidt. I wonder whether you have thought on what kind of governance will be attached to the policy measures that you're suggesting, because the problem with any sort of transfers within the European system, particularly towards the south in Greece, is that without the kind of money we've been getting is low quality money, because the governance that is attached to that money, whether they come to the money, whether they come after the Eurozone accession or during the 80s, the conditionality attached to them was too weak, as a result of which capacity was undermined. So I was wondering whether you have thought about the governance attached to the policies that you have thought about. Thank you.
Shall we start with Professor Schmidt? Is it okay?
I'm not sure whether I got each question right, but you can correct me and may turn back to me. To the first comment, as I understood that Greece might have truly comparative advantages to other countries, other member states in the European Union. You mentioned, for instance, shipping industry and oil transport and things like that here. A study by the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin with one Greek among the authors came up to the one interesting conclusion that Greece might well utilize and exploit much more the so-called diaspora of extremely highly qualified academics in other countries, and provide incentives that they come back and to invest into high-tech green technology, for instance, and information communication technologies and so on. And maybe even to establish specialized universities or academies in this area as a way to get a stronger competitive stance. There is a potential, although not only in terms of raw material, but also in terms of brain capacities, and this might be much more exploited. With respect to the issue of self-employment, as a labor market policy expert, I can only just respond with one illustrative example, how far you could also promote the self-employment. In Germany, one of the really successful elements of the reform, of the labor market reforms, has been the capitalizing of unemployment benefits for the support of self-employment. So as a kind of investment, so you do not get the benefits monthly, but as in capitalized forms that you have an investment. This was quite successful to use more self-employment, and self-employment even in a way which was creating new jobs. And so the range of possibilities of modern, what I call modern labor market services and building up capacities is much wider than one can think of. I'm so sorry I didn't get your question because I had the interpretation. You spoke English, but I got the Greek. Maybe you have to repeat it if it is important and not answered by my colleagues. Yeah, okay. And there was the issue of about very important issue in my view about for dynamic and sustainable economic development is to have really fair institutions which provide a fair risk sharing between the costs of investment which occur today and the benefits which occur later on, if any benefits come from the investments. This is a very tricky thing to have this kind of fair risk sharing. And I tried to explain, for instance, the success of the short-time working benefit scheme, which is really, in a way, a fair risk sharing between the employers, the employees, and the state, which jumps in. Another way of fair risk sharing is, for instance, the dual learning systems, where people learn on the job on the one hand, but also at the same time in the schools or in the academies, and where the state provides the infrastructure. So as far as I know, that the dual learning system, the apprenticeship system is underdeveloped, if existing in Greek, but the dual learning system can also be extended to the academies by vocational training academies, for instance, where the state, the firms, and the municipalities share the investment risk, and even the students might also share some risk if they repay some kind of their scholarships later on when their income level exceeds the threshold. With respect to the transfers, I know exactly. I know that the ideas I developed, the proposals, would induce to some extent long-term transfers from the rich countries to the poorer countries. But as I tried to develop, for instance, my model of the European investment fund, social investment fund, would work basically providing transfers for building up infrastructure and transfers by form of credit, which would have to be repaid by the individual member states later on. So there would not be the permanent transfers. But it's too short here to explain it more in extension. But this is the advantage of the model which is presently currently debated about the European unemployment insurance, which is a unified insurance system which would induce very long-term transfer, permanent transfers for at least the 6 or 7 rich countries.
I'll try to be super quick. So, in Greek, ποιος ψάχνει δουλειά και δεν βρίσκει, πραγματικά υπάρχει πρόβλημα με δουλειές, πραγματικά έχουμε κρίση, αλλά η αλήθεια είναι ότι εν μέρη ο λόγος για τον οποίο δεν έχουμε δουλειές είναι και ότι έχουμε αυτή την ψευδαίσθηση ότι η Ελλάδα είναι πρώτη σε αυτό και πρώτη στο άλλο, αντί για να κοιτάμε που πραγματικά θέλει διόρθωση με τρόικα, χωρίς τρόικα κτλ. Ήθελα να το πω, το είπα. On self-employment, I think Greece has a problem of self-employment not being either the entrepreneurial type or the coping type. I think there's a lot of cultural a cultural dimension to this, where Greeks who want to be self-employed are overly, not necessarily everybody, but overly people who do not want to have a boss on the top of the head, which I think again speaks again about the particularity and the mentality of the Greeks, and how we address that is the $1 million question also about the crisis. And just on the question on the middle class and the middle class squeeze, I don't think this is related to the crisis either as a cause or as an effect. This is a secular, a very long-term trend, but it didn't cause the crisis, I don't think, and I don't think it's going to be either the sort of, you know, in any respect, resolving that will solve the crisis or anything. This is something that we have to get used to it. There's nothing wrong with having less of a middle class.
Thank you, Professor Salvador.
Can I use yours? I would like to say two things. First, on economics. I think economics is not there to tell us how the world should be, but I'd like to also defend the use of analysis. It's my conviction that the United Kingdom and subsequently now Germany would not have a minimum wage if the research by Card and Kruger hadn't been done in the US in the beginning of the 1990s. That's just analysis of the employment effects of the minimum wage. The same holds for the Occupy movement and all the discussion about top income shares. If the distribution of income from tax records had not been analyzed, we wouldn't know. So I think there's an important role for analyzing and giving the results of analysis to the public and to policymakers. So I think I almost did a step too far in pleading for an earned income tax credit and a minimum wage, but I mean, that's my personal conviction that might help, but I have no idea. I would say this is the moment to do it, but I'm not sure at all. I mean, that's people who are active in policy making could say much better than I do. There was another question about this, this analysis of dual earners and their importance and what it might say for Greece, for collective negotiations, for regional effects, etc. I think a collective agreement should disregard that effect. They should focus on the individual. And in the redistribution, you need that earned income tax credit to compensate for that. And that would help to diminish regional effects if dual earner households are, say, more concentrated in the big cities than in the countryside, but that may be different between countries. I think that such an EITC would help to allow these other things, but that's not something that I've fully analyzed, but that's my first feelings about that kind of questions. I think I should stop there.
So I don't want to, I think that there is a coffee break now and I don't want to keep people sort of away from their coffee, so I'll be very fast. I think that there are two questions that I wanted to address. One had to do with the generosity and unemployment relationship that you mentioned. The generosity and employment relationship is not sort of as interesting to me as the relationship between generosity and inequality, and the effect, the intermediary effect of generosity over the effect of unemployment over inequality. But I mean, this is social science and political science. There is nothing that is unquestionable, and there is no relationship that is well established. I mean, you can find a number of alternative theoretical reasons, theoretical intuitions that would explain different sort of endogenous and exogenous factors, different directions of causality, and it's just a question sort of analyzing and seeing sort of which ones work. The second question has to do with what will follow capitalism. I'm not an economist. I'm not going to jump in to sort of defend economics, although I very much sort of agree with Wimmer Salverda about this. But I think it's sort of a false dichotomy to present sort of the market as the only option in economics or in political economy. There obviously the role of the state as a provider of protection and compensation and skills and resolving the negative externalities that come with inequality. I mean, this is part of the political economy, institutional complementarities and institutional comparative advantages, etc., that we deal with in political science all the time. I don't think that the mystery or sort of the issue really is the lack of an alternative in terms of this capitalism question in political economy, but perhaps sort of the lack of imagination in terms of mainstream left parties and mainstream sort of center-left parties in thinking about political options that would be sort of productive and that would not just be thinking about the market. So, but that's a different question that has little to do with sort of economics or political economy in a social science way.
Okay. After what we've heard, I think I have to pronounce capitalism very much alive. Not exceptionally well from a social and democratic point of view, but certainly not at risk. And I'm afraid I have to sign this declaration with my red pen. I will have 20 minutes break. Thank you.
Απλώς να πω για τους φοιτητές, δεν χρειάζεται σε αυτή την ενότητα, γιατί είναι πιο σύντομο το διάλειμμα και έχουν καθυστερήσει λίγο να πάτε πάλι να δηλώσετε συμμετοχή σας. Θα το κάνουμε μόνο στην τελευταία ενότητα. Εντάξει.